So welcome everybody, and I will get everything started. Take the poll while you're waiting. Where is my little share button? There it is. Okay, before I start though, is Zoom showing weird gray boxes today, or is it all good? No, it's good. Okay. Well, every time it updates, it's a little different. So I just wanted to make sure. Welcome to the Clements Library Bookworm. This is our 72nd episode. I am Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. Today's meeting is being recorded to share online, and this afternoon you will receive an email with the recording and resources mentioned in today's broadcast. Just in case you're joining us for the first time or need a reminder, we do use the chat during our broadcast, and my colleague Helen Harding will be monitoring the chat and pasting in information. You are welcome to chime in. We just ask that you change the setting to everyone so that the conversation is visible to all. However, if you have a question for today's panelist, if you would please put that in the Q&A section. You can also see the questions that other people are asking and give it a thumbs up to reorder the questions, in effect, upvoting it so that we know what people are interested in talking about. As part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion program, we have the live machine captions turned on today. You can toggle those on or off and change the size. So play around with that so it looks good to you. And once again, I can only control so much of what you see, and side-by-side mode is enabled, which should allow you to see both the speakers and the slides. So move the separator to change the relative size of each so that it looks good to you. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of the history and culture of North America and the Caribbean to about 1900. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabeg ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. All right. If you haven't clicked yet on our poll questions, click them quickly. Just a couple of questions about, let's see, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Okay. Today we are lucky enough to hear about a book that is not yet published, and that is unusual for us. So I was curious to see how often people pre-order books, and I see that about 12% say they often do, and almost 60% say sometimes, and 31% say never. So I just was curious about that a little bit. And then also to see some of the reasons why people sign in for the bookworm. So I appreciate that feedback as well. And I think you can all see the results on your screen. And if anybody thinks of any other feedback related to that topic, you are welcome to put it in the chat or to send me an email. You can just respond to the reminder that you got. Today's episode is generously sponsored by Jean and Bob Julier. Jean and Bob, thank you so much for your ongoing enthusiasm for the bookworm and for the sponsorship of today's topic. And now I'm delighted to introduce and welcome today's guests. Joining us is Paul Erickson, the Randolph G. Adams Director of the Clements Library, and Bethany Hughes, an enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. Bethany is a performance scholar and cultural historian. Her work focuses on representation of Native Americans in theatrical performance and contemporary Indigenous performance. Her book on Redface in American Theater, coming out in December with NYU Press, articulates the aesthetic, racial, and political implications of the Indian in live theater. Bethany teaches classes on Native American studies, Indigenous performance, race and musical theater, and American performance. Her writing can be found in Theater Journal, American Periodicals, Theater Survey, American Indian Quarterly, Mobilities, and HowRound.com, among others. I'm excited for this conversation and would like to welcome you both to the program.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes,
I am in the chat right now going to put a link to the artist who did the book cover. I actually love the artwork on the cover, in part because I got to pick it. And so I just wanted to shout out to Tom Jones, who's a Ho-Chunk artist out of Wisconsin. And these are images from a collection of installation that he did called Cultural Appropriation.
So Bethany, are you going to jump into your presentation now, or?
Yes, thank you. I was waiting for direction.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, I think I don't have control of the slides, so I'll
Okay.
just say advance or something like that.
Great.
So first I would like to sort of orient us to Redface as a practice. Redface as a word that means something like a sort of generic or stereotypical racialized representation of Native Americans in live performance, or perhaps it means something like a non-Native American portraying a character that is Native American. That usage of the word is actually relatively new, just a few decades old, really, when it's gotten into circulation, primarily in sort of journalism and some sort of advocacy and activism circles that are, organizing for better representation of Native Americans. So, so kind of, it's not exactly prior to 2000, but kind of prior to 2000, that was just not the word that people used to describe or talk about these phenomenon. So in part, the reason why I wrote the book is so that we would have an actual beginning of a conversation about what Redface actually is and what it isn't. And how to best think about it as far as its implications for theater, for audiences, and also for Native people. So to begin with, theatrical representations of Native Americans predate the existence of the United States. It's unsurprising. My work is focused on American theatrical history, so it doesn't pay too much attention to things outside of it, but it is something that is definitely shaped by Western theatrical history, English, French primarily. The Spanish has a different tradition that I don't really get into in the book at all. So these are images from some of the earliest representations on sort of European stages of what is called the Indian. And I will use the Indian like as a word regularly in this. And what I mean is that generic racial category of people that is created by Western European logics of race and peoplehood and geography and all of those kind of things. So on the left is a costume design. If you're familiar with Ben Jonson, who is one of like the biggest costume set designers of the 17th century in England. He has amazing work. And this is one of his designs for a mask, which it's a little bit like a pageantry spectacle driven performance made for court. Royalty often like perform in them for fun also, but it's a very elite live entertainment in the 17th century. So this image is of a torchbearer, an Indian torchbearer that accompanies a character called a Virginian prince. So what we might think of as a chief or a king of an Indian tribe is what it is. And you'll see that this is some feathers, this sort of body stocking kind of sense, but not the kind of depiction that you would see in, say, a 21st century sports mascot or Land O'Lakes butter or something like that, right? It's not identical to a 21st century representation of the same sort of generic racial figure. On the right is a costume design for a 1766 French opera ballet. It's four sort of short stories all put together, and one of them is set in America. And so this is the sauvage, this is the savage, this is the Indian, which relies much more on sort of greenery. But still with a weapon, the club, but does not have the kind of feathers and red as that becomes later. So you can advance to the next slide. So there are European origins to this. What I work on and try to convincingly portray and explain in the book is that Redface is not just the costume pieces or the makeup that an actor is wearing. This is one of the things that I think limits our understanding of both the complexity of Redface and the impacts of Redface. If we just think the surface level phenomenon, we're not really understanding what it actually does and how it actually does it. And so the point of the book, the main idea is that Redface is a collaborative curatorial process by which audiences and artists construct a legibly Indian body on stage. And so I'm really interested in what are the processes, what are the components of the process that actually create something that we can understand and call an Indian on a stage. Thinking through if somebody is wearing a feathered headdress and you say, oh yes, now I know that that character is Native American. It's not really the feathered headdress that's doing the work. It's really the audience member interpreting the sort of visual imagery and the information. And it's not really just the actor doing the work, right? It's not just the person who's on the stage, and it's not just the person who's wearing the headdress, because without an audience that understands and can interpret that information, the character sort of falls flat, right? It doesn't become anything. And so I was really interested in this tension and also collaboration in this work between people that the byproduct is the creation of an Indian. Next slide. So the book begins in the early 19th century when the figure of the stage Indian becomes prominent and popular. Sort of received theater history in the United States. Says the 1830s and a little into the 1840s, there was an Indian play fad, and American audiences just loved a story about Indians with Indians in it. It was a period of time when melodrama was very popular, so there was very clear sort of good and bad, right and wrong, villains and heroes, and Indians slotted into these kind of stories. The images you see on the screen The bottom two are of an actor named Edwin Forrest, who I talk about quite a bit in the book. He was sort of the first American superstar actor. Very, very successful, very long career, made a lot of money, had a scandalous celebrity divorce, court case. If you're familiar with 19th century theater history and have heard of the Astor riots, the Astor Place riots, the riots between opposing fans of two leading actors who got into violent confrontation on the streets of New York over which actor was doing the best interpretation of the Shakespearean role that we're playing concurrently. Edwin Forrest fans were half of that thing. So he had this devoted fan base and was incredibly successful. He specialized in really dramatic, one might call them overly dramatic roles, tragic heroes. And the images you see are from the 1829 play by John Augustus Soane, Metamora, or The Last of the Wampanoag, in which Edwin Forrest, the play was written for him, plays Metamora, which is based on Metacomet, sometimes called King Philip. So it's a story about King Philip's War. And he plays this incredibly noble chief who calls out the lies and the sort of malicious nature of the English colonial forces, goes up against them and loses. In the final moments of the play, he is shot and killed and sort of utters a curse in his last dying, very dramatic moment. So Indians weren't necessarily the villains in 19th century, early 19th century plays, particularly during this Indian play fad. They were often heroes, often admirable. Sometimes there were villains also, but not exclusively villains. The other image is from actually an earlier play that was from 1807, 1808, which began a long tradition of Pocahontas plays, of plays that are about the Pocahontas John Smith, John Rolfe story. This one is actually from not the image, but the play is one that I read in the Clements library that you all have one of the early publications of, which was lovely to read. So I can talk more about that later. Next slide. So by the end of this Indian play fad, which I would love to talk about perhaps in the conversation, Paul, that it wasn't really that much of a fad. It actually was a very persistent preference among American audiences for many different forms of live theatrical entertainment. And that's related to a digital database project that I'm working on in relation to this project. So I can talk more about that later. So by the sort of late 19th century, the way that the Indian was coming to be known and available to American audiences shifted quite significantly. The noble savage, the vanishing Indian hero like Metamora really gives way to the rise of a much more familiar to 21st century audiences, the savage Indian, the violent attacks on settlers, attacks on wagon trains, battles with the cavalry. All of that starts becoming much more common in theatrical representations of Native Americans. One of the major influences that most of the listeners and the people who are watching this now know is the Buffalo Bill Wild West show that was incredibly popular, traveled globally, toured for decades across the US, Canada, Western Europe. And then there were other Wild West shows, dozens of them that were not exactly knockoffs of the Buffalo Wild West, but competitors, and some of them were just knockoffs of the Buffalo Bill Wild West. And those also traveled into pretty much Anglophone global population, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. And so with the Buffalo Bill Wild West, so William F. Cody hired almost exclusively Ochechi Cohen. So this is sometimes called Sioux, from primarily the Pine Ridge Agency, and then is now called the Pine Ridge Reservation. And so that was actually a pretty narrow ethnic and tribal community. And the markers of that specific, what we sometimes call Sioux, became the standard in these Wild West shows. And so though a Wild West show might hire Native Americans to perform in the Wild West show, they actually specifically asked them to appear in the dress and manner of what we know as the Sioux. And so the shift in the visual markers happens across the late 19th century. And the Wild West show, as you might know, has things like the Indians attacking the wagon train, the Indians attacking the settler. They were battle reenactments between the Battle of Greasy Grass or Custer's Last Stand, right? Like that battle. And so there was this repeated presentation of violent Indians attacking Americans, and almost always the Americans win. Or if they don't win, in the case of the Custer's Last Stand battle, and that Buffalo Bill would ride out at the end of that scene where everybody's, like lying dead on the grounds, and he would ride out on his horse, and then they would project with their, turn of the 20th century technology, too late. That essentially says if Buffalo Bill had actually just arrived a little bit earlier, he could have turned the tide and it would not have resulted in like the defeat of Custer's forces. So we shift in those kind of representational practice and the kind of stories that American audiences are receiving about Indians, which then sort of moves into 20th century representations. There's a poster advertisement from a 1900 play on Broadway called A Stranger in a Strange Land. Currently, the script to this play is lost, but there are several really vivid posters that suggest a storyline about a man traveling to England who claims to hold like a cattle ranch or something like that, and a very well-dressed man in like a tuxedo kind of like very formal attire in one poster, where his friend says, when I'm through with you, you'll look like an Indian. And then the next poster shows this image that I'm showing you now, which is the very elite non-native dressed as an Indian. And so you can see that there's some continuity from the 19th into the early 20th century about visual markers, but then there are other things that shift. And so the stage Indian and Redface practices are always reliant upon these theatrical techniques of costuming and makeup and characterization and dramatic arc and storytelling. And the different sort of techniques are getting moved around, and they might look a little different, they might act a little different, they might sound a little different across these times. But what they're continuously doing is creating this process by which artists and audiences work together to come to some sort of agreement on which bodies on stage are Indians. And this process has very high stakes implications in the world, outside of a theater building, off of a stage space, right? So an off stage space. So there's a moment in the book, in one of the chapters, where I spend a little bit of time talking about what this process of recognition and this sort of co-creation of what an Indian is, how that filters into much higher stakes environments. Things like lawsuits that depend upon recognizing or defining the racial category of a person that then reveals whether they have a slave or free status in a society, right? It becomes very high stakes about what a racial identification is. And people are using their own judgment. We talked about census gathering, right? Like, how do we even count in the US who's who and what's what? And the way that census enumerators were determining people's racial profiles based on their encounters with them, right? And relying on these skills of recognizing what makes someone legibly Indian in spaces about being counted, in spaces about jurisdiction and law, in spaces around like marriage rights, like who can marry who and which races can marry which races, right? So while this process of this like collaborative process of legibility is happening on stage, it's also the exact same skill and tool that's being used off stage to have these incredibly high stakes impacts upon Native communities. Next slide. Most of the book is an exploration of the processes that create Redface, how we collaborate artists and audiences together, what kinds of components seem to be always present or really necessary for Redface to like successfully create these sort of racialized, legibly Indian bodies. I spend time talking about historical accuracy, how that's the sort of the discourse around historical accuracy travels with Redface as a way of sort of authenticating it or justifying it. There's also an ongoing interest in connecting performance of Redface to specific Native American communities or individuals. And these sort of tactics happen repeatedly in slightly different directions, but are always in sort of service of what you might call American dominant cultures, sort of control and mastery over the identity formation of Native Americans, right? It's about who gets to decide who is Indian and what the criteria for being Indian are. So by the end of the book, I knew that that many of the readers and many of the people that I talked to about this are actually really interested in, like how do we make right this really long history of reductive, stereotypical, sometimes just downright racist representational practices that we know are not accurate to Native nations and Native lives. How can we fix this? And so I spend some time in the book also talking about attempts to do that. I focus on the 1946 musical Annie Get Your Gun and its 1999 revival on Broadway, where they significantly changed a whole lot, cut a lot of songs, changed characters, cut characters, added characters in an attempt to present a less racist, right? What you might call anti-racist, although that wasn't the word at the time. It was maybe more politically correct was the term that was being used in the late 90s. Like, what would it mean to actually try to fix Redface? And so I talked through the sort of theatrical techniques that they used about costuming, about casting, about dialogue, about character development, about singing, about dancing, to try to fix these histories that are so problematic and so damaging. And there's some fair bit of discussion too about how hard it is, in part because if you think Redface is the costume and is the makeup and is the singing and the dancing, then you're not fully understanding because you're not actually dealing with the process, that collaborative process. And if the collaborative process is still trying to create a singular racialized figure of the Indian, you're still doing Redface. You just are using different costumes. So, because that's kind of a downer to end a book on, I also included a short essay that that brings up the history of Indigenous theater and Indigenous performers' use of live performance to sort of their own ends. And so there's a discussion of contemporary Indigenous theater history in about the last 50 years in US and Canada, but also looking at how Indigenous performers like early 20th century vaudeville, Broadway, film, radio, print journalism star Will Rogers, who's Cherokee, about he navigated his own space through performances, right? Like at a time he was the highest paid actor in Hollywood in the early 30s. Like he beat out like Mae West and like Shirley Temple one year. So he's an incredibly successful Native performer who really challenges this sort of Redface, the expectation that Redface was the dominant and the only, right? And so I really try to offer other ways that Indigenous performers have been, offering alternatives for 200 years, right? Like this wasn't that there was never another alternative for American audiences. It's just the dominance of Redface and the expectation of looking for these racialized figures led people to not be able to recognize, like Will Rogers, so by the time of his death certificate recorded him as white. And there was this sort of absolute absence of understanding of the complexity of his own racial makeup, but also his identity as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. So that's my attempt to buffer the challenges of Redface and the critiques that I bring up towards the end of the book about how difficult it is to change, because there is and has always been an alternative to Redface if we're talking about performances and theater that represents Native lives. I think that's it. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Bethany. First of all, thank you for letting me see an advance copy of the book before its release.
I can't hear you, Paul.
Oh,
and
you
I don't know if
cannot.
it's just me.
Can you hear me, Angela?
I can hear him.
Okay. How about now? Can you hear me now, Bethany?
I can.
Okay, great. Great. So thank you so much for the talk about the book, and also thank you for letting me see an advanced copy of it, which is enormously helpful. I'm really grateful for that. But the advanced copy that I got did not have the cover, so it's really exciting to see that beautiful cover. So I was struck reading the book about its unconventional organization. The essay that you spoke about just at the end of your remarks appears in the book in kind of an unusual way. Can you talk a bit about that and why you chose to arrange the book the way you did?
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time thinking about form as content, and took my cue from some Indigenous scholars who are working in things like literature, sound studies, musicology, who are also really trying to use the form of academic writing to demonstrate or to provide an example of their intellectual contribution. So that's one of them. The other thing is I wrote most of this book during the like deep pandemic lockdown years. I had a fellowship for a year, 2020-21 academic year, where I had dedicated time to just get a draft of the book done. This was a moment, as you are well aware, where archives and libraries shut down, where research funding was frozen. There was there were a lot of constraints happening. And I basically spent the summer of 2020 rethinking what book could I write in the time that I had to get a draft done that said what I wanted to say based on the research I'd already completed. So there were chapters. There was one chapter that I had dreamed of that I never got to do the archival research. So I had, had to pivot. And I thought, as an untenured junior faculty, I know I have sort of guaranteed research funding and guaranteed job and time to do this. But tenure's not a guarantee and a career is not a guarantee. And I thought, I really want to make a book that I want to exist in the world. Like if this is the book I get to make, if I get to write one book, I want it. I told people I want it to be beautiful and true. And that's what I wanted the writing to be. So it went through a couple iterations of what that would look like. I wanted to make sure that there was a response to this like really overwhelming sense of Redface as the only thing, the way that everybody in America understands Indians, and sort of like the limitations and the constraints of like, is the whole world just Redface and is there's nothing else? Knowing, because I study Indigenous performance and contemporary theatrical practice, I know there's not, right? Like there's other things out there and there's other ways, and really interesting and exciting and intriguing and thought-provoking kind of art that's being made by Indigenous artists. And I knew that there was this at least multi-decade history of Indigenous artists, not just Larissa Fast Horse's The Thanksgiving play on Broadway a year or so ago was phenomenal, and the first known female playwright to have a play on Broadway. I mean, a Native playwright. But the first known male Native playwright to have a play on Broadway is happening in like the 1930s. Like Lynn Riggs is doing it, right? So so what that says about basically 100 years of absence on the like Broadway stage is like another conversation. But the, part of the reason why contemporary 21st century Indigenous theater and performance is so vibrant is because there's this 100-year history. And like, if you add in Will Rogers, if you add in the performers across vaudeville, if you add in, Gawango Mohawk, who's like writing plays for herself to perform pants roles in like the late 19th century. If you think about anyway, like there's just like way more interesting things happening than just Redface. And I wanted to at least gesture to my readers for them to know like there's a whole other world out there that's actually really interesting. And so because so much of the book is about this process, about the collaboration, and really trying to implicate the audience in it. Like if Redface isn't just costume and makeup that actors put on, and so like directors made racist decisions or costumers made racist decisions or individual actors are just portraying racist characters, right? If I sort of force you to remove that understanding about the location of Redface, if I'm forcing audiences to understand that the audience is part of Redface too, then I also need to give them an opportunity to think through what would you rather be a part of? If you have these skills of reading characters, of interpreting characters, of paying attention, of working with artists, those can be turned in different directions. And so I wanted to give an opportunity for like, what would it feel like to turn your attention and to put those skills as an audience member to a different purpose? And so that's why I wrote this essay. But I also know that it's really hard and really uncomfortable. If what you're trained to do really well as an audience member is to see who an Indian is on stage, it becomes actually really challenging to interpret and encounter Native American plays and playwrights' work. Years ago, I was at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival at a performance, their first play that was written by a Native American author, a playwright. And at intermission, it was an adaptation of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, I think, Off the Rails by Randy Reinholtz. And I sat there at intermission, you turn and have the chat with the person next to you during intermission. How are you liking the play? How are you liking the play? And this woman said, I came to see a play about Indians. This is a play about a man and a woman, and was like really irritated that the play wasn't doing what she wanted it to do, which was to talk about Indians. And as a Native person watching this play, where these characters are talking about things like what is their obligation to their community? How do they understand themselves as part of something, but also as within constraints of systems that they may or may not be buying into? Intra-family conflict about what it means to fight against or accept the kind of systems that are, like all of these things that were really recognizable to me from my own experiences. And I thought, oh, wow, like we're watching different shows. Like I'm reading this as completely Native, and she's reading this as not Native at all. And so to demonstrate what kind of labor would go into shifting your attention, I wanted to make it a little hard to read that essay, which meant that there had to be lots of iterations of like, how long of an essay can you read hard? And in what way can it be hard? And like, how much will people stick with me if it's this kind of hard? And so this is like what ended up happening over the course of a couple years is there's one essay. I think it's relatively short, but maybe it's not. And it's woven throughout the book, and you have to follow it, right? Like it appears as you're reading as a disruption. And it appears as you're reading as something incomprehensible because it's not about the thing that you're reading about. If you're reading, forward, like you would typically read in an academic book, or most books in English. So it's essentially, it's a rehearsal, right? The pages are different.
And that's what it looks like.
Right. So so we had to discuss like, how do we visually mark for readers that this is a shift? This page right here will be a shift in your thinking and your reading practice. And how do we give enough information? So, at the bottom of those pages are like continued on page X. So we have to give like textual visual markers that say this is different. Where should you go next? The pages of the essay are actually in places for very particular reasons, for thematic, topical, temporal reasons. Like I actually spent a lot of time thinking about like where should this idea live in physical proximity with these other ideas. But that's not something that's communicated clearly. So that's a thing that people could think about if they wanted to. But yeah, so I wanted people to rehearse. That's it. Rehearse the pleasure and the work that it would take to create a different kind of process.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting way to structure a book, and I think every reader is going to choose to read that essay in different ways. So just as somebody who's interested in physical books, it was a really interesting way to encounter this book. So a lot of members of our audience are probably familiar with terms blackface and yellowface as concepts in performance. Redface, as you define it in the book, functions differently, I think, because it is explicitly about questions of sovereignty and politics in ways that maybe blackface and yellowface aren't. So can you just talk a little bit about how you see those three modes of performance as being different?
Yeah. So the first thing I normally say when I'm having this conversation with people is that these are theatrical techniques that use the same theatrical strategies, right? They rely upon the visual, the narrative, the dramaturgical skills of theater, right? So there's actually a lot of crossover or overlap in, right? Makeup, costuming, accents, construction of dialogue, of dialect, right? That's a way we get around saying like racially reductive language use and diction, right? So those sort of technologies in the theater are employed in different directions. And so they're resonant because it's the same sort of technologies, but they're actually not working towards the same ends. They're all working to racialize populations, right? So there's again a resonance of like what's the result of creating these characters, telling these stories, indicating to audiences and audiences interpreting those things as Indian, as Asian, as Black, right? So there's again, so the other layers of overlap. So there are all these tools of racialization. And in trying to articulate Redface beyond a tool of racialization is really getting to the heart of one of the major questions and sort of problems within Native American studies and Native American community is how to articulate a really full sense of what it means to be Indigenous to North America. And race is one component, but it's not the only component. And so in the book, I spend a lot of time trying to say, like, if you're only talking about race, then actually you're participating in a project that depoliticizes Indigenous nations. And this is why Redface is so hard to fix, because you're not actually trying to fix just the racialization component. You're trying to fix what the racialization covers over and justifies, which is the denial of Indigenous sovereignty, of rights of self-determination, of the ability to define their own citizenry, of the ability to say, like, there is no race that is Native American. There are nations that are Native American. There are tribes and bands and villages and pueblos that are Native American. That is the constitute. So, there are ethnicities within Native American is a way to talk about, right? Like, so I'm Choctaw. And so when people say things like, how Native are you? Or how much are you? Or things like that, which I get not frequently, but regularly. I try to shift the answers into, I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I'm also a citizen of the United States of America. So you can think about it like dual citizenship. And yes, I am a racialized person and I am biracial. And so we could talk about that, but my racial identity is not the thing that determines my citizenship in my nation. Like, I'm Choctaw because I'm Choctaw. We're a lineal descent tribe, not a blood quantum tribe. That's a different conversation. So race is one component of how I experience the world as a Native person, but the political process and citizenship rights and responsibilities that I have as a member of the Choctaw Nation. And so this is the thing that Native artists and activists and advocates and scholars have sort of been trying to explain to the rest of the world for a very long time, right? This book doesn't create these concepts. It just tries to explain this is how they work out in this like very commercial entertainment form of American theater, right? Like this idea of boiling down Indians into a race is both inaccurate and problematic and damaging, and we can talk about that, but it is also a political attack on Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous nationhood, because if all you are is a race, you're not a nation. And so this is why we can have, in a few weeks, Native American Heritage Month, but not Native American Tribal Sovereignty Month, right? Because the inherent need for the United States to like have control over all of the land. Like you can't really fully admit tribal sovereignty and still maintain any sort of justification for the level of dominance that the US has over Native nations. And so the book also goes into like the explanation for that and the kind of scholarly language of settler colonialism to try to articulate what that dynamic is.
And you know, the issue that I have with all of those months is that they are, you know, it's whether it's Black History Month or Native American Heritage Month, they're entirely situated in the past. So like there's no like, let's talk about Native American Present Month, which is kind of the argument that you're trying to make in the book. So a lot of folks in the audience are probably familiar with the idea of Redface in maybe some different contexts. So they may know Phil Deloria's book, Playing Indian, you know, which talks about things like the Boston Tea Party, where colonists in Boston famously dressed as Mohawks to throw tea into Boston Harbor, or they have seen sporting events with teams from Kansas City or Atlanta, and you know, seen the things that fans in those stadiums do. You make a really compelling argument early in the book about why theater is a good way to think about what is fundamentally a political question. Can you talk about a bit about why? I mean, you're a historian of theater and performance, so like, yes, that's what you're interested in, but why is theater a good way to explore these much bigger questions that you're getting at?
I love this question because I love theater. So I'm always happy to try to explain to people why they should pay more attention to it. So theater does a lot of stuff in a really short amount of time in a very like circumscribed event, right? So there is narratives which are incredibly appointments. So somebody who's like, because I pay a lot of attention to stories and I pay a lot of attention to how stories are told and the components of stories, because my own experiences as a dramaturg and working in theater, you know, kind of right out of college time, the way that we tell stories about ourselves shapes who we are, right? Like this, we know stories and storytelling within Native American studies are like they're foundational. Like this is how we know who we are. This is how we understand ourselves and the world around us. And like theater's just stories, particularly the commercial kind of theater that I'm looking at in this book. I know there's other post-dramatic theater and performance, and like that's a whole other conversation, much more in the weeds for like the theater scholar type people. But so it's just stories, and it's stories of people making sense of the world around them, the past, the present. So that's one thing, is you get a really good feel for what a culture is interested in, what a culture is concerned about, what a particular moment of time, how ideas that are often embodied through characters get worked out, sometimes in really obvious ways and sometimes in much more subtle ways. But you also are in a much, like theatrical performance is heightened, right? So everything on stage you see is not really real, but everything on stage you see is also really real, right? There's actually real people and real like wood that they're standing on and real lights that are shining real light on real faces. And yet it's also totally not real, right? And so there's something really interesting about the sort of liminality of theatrical experience for both the audience and the artist, right? Like the audience are also part of a world that is very real and also not real. And so this allows us to sort of explore and play around and think in ways that can be productive and in ways that can be very harmful, right? Like it's not like theater is a tool or an experience that is always good, and it's not benign. It's just always a space that offers potential. And so there's liberatory potential and there's less liberatory potential. So you have storytelling, you have this like liminality that allows for an exploration of the real and the unreal, which gives you a lot of space often to like think about the past. And to rewrite the past and to rewrite the past again. Like this happens with Pocahontas plays all the time, right? Like it's the same like plot points, but the story is different. And then how we fill in the details and how we arrange the plot points and how we think about the characters, right? So there's like this working out that happens in theatrical performance. And the other thing that like makes theater and not just, you know, literature or another kind of form of storytelling is that it's always people. And the presence of people in time and space together is just different than being by yourself in a room. I'm really interested in sort of the ethical implications of humans interacting with other humans. Like, what are like the rules of engagement when you're a human watching another human? Performance artists have been exploring this for like decades of, you know, like how far can you push an audience before they'll stop something that they think is harmful on stage, whether it's really harmful or not. And that liminality of like, is this real? Is this not real? Right. You know, like all of this. So there's this thing that happens about people being together that forces them to, if not think about, to experience what it means to be humans together. And in the storytelling, they think and practice what kind of humans do they want to be together. And in the rewriting of history or the exploring or the making of an imagined world, they think through and can rehearse what kind of humans do we want to have at all, right? Like, what do we want to be and how do we want to be it? Under what circumstances could we be the kind of humans we want to be? Under what circumstances can we never be the kind of humans we want to be? What happens when we have groups who have very diverging and contested versions of the kinds of humans we should be, right? So I think theater is a really remarkable space as far as for discussing racialization in particular. It's kind of just like a microcosm of what happens in everyday life. And it becomes really clear because theater gets rid of all the extra and all the complications of life and makes it actually really simple, right? Like we just have one character to follow or two characters, and then there's like a subplot that maybe you can forget. So it actually really clarifies what's happening in stories and in people. And so that actually makes it kind of easier to track, like, how is race working? What is the construction process? How is the society like interacting with this human as they've been categorized in a particular way? And you can get rid of all of the like distractions and complexities of real life. So it's like a laboratory, it's like this liminal space, it's exploratory, it's deeply human and like with bodies, and bodies are so deeply inconvenient, but also so deeply amazing, right? And like you're forced to deal with like live performance and the way that you have to. So I saw a show in Chicago years and years ago called Amazing Grace, and there's a scene and it's ship captain and there's a, you know, like a storm happening, you know, the lights and the sound and the whatever, like it's happening, and like the ship's bell fell off the stage, like fell off the wall in the middle of this like dramatic scene, and the guy's singing and it smacks his head really hard. And I was in the balcony in like the cheap seats and I heard it hit his head. And I was like, oh, that's not okay. Like he's not okay. And all of a sudden this moment that was supposed to be about like the internal struggle of this character became this like, there's a human who just got a blow to his head from what looked like a pretty heavy bell. And now what does that mean as an audience member? What am I forced to contend with? And what is the actor forced to contend with? He did finish the show, and the next day there was an announcement that he was going to be out because he was concussed. And I was like, yeah, was there, saw that, right? And I'm glad that they're taking him out because that was rough, and I'm surprised he finished the show. Okay, that was a long meandering to why theater is amazing.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I really love about the book is that your love for theater shows throughout the book, and so that's just something that I really enjoyed. You talked a bit about sort of the long tradition of Redface in European and American performance. So it's, you know, you can't really say here's an origin point, this is where it starts, but you talked about Metamora as sort of a uniquely influential play in the history of Redface. And it's a play that I'm sure most people have never read or never seen, and it's kind of impossible to understand how popular it was. I mean, you point out in the book that there are multiple towns named after Metamora. It's like if there was a Willie Loman, Pennsylvania, or Guys and Dolls, Idaho, which is a place I would go visit. So what was it about that play that made it so wildly popular at that time? It was, I mean, Forrest's celebrity was part of it, but was there something about the play that really caught people's attention?
Um, That's a good question. I have some ideas, but there's not a definitive sort of accepted answer in like the scholarly history of it. Um, it is the most popular, and I think that is definitely connected to Forrest, right? Like he is the most popular, and so anything he shows up is going to do. But it's also coming at this time. It's really like it starts kind of right before he hits it really big.
Mhm.
So it's on the upswing of his career. The play is written for him. He created a playwriting contest. And the first year, the inaugural year, I think the prize was like $250 or $300, which in 1829 is significant. And he said, I want it, I want the hero to be an Aboriginal of this country. And so he really demanded that it be an Indian play, and he wanted to be the Indian. He had played an Indian in a different production a couple years before and had some real success in it. In my actual favorite Indian play, She Would Be a Soldier. I actually really like that one. I think it's the only Indian play that you could actually produce in the 21st century. Like pretty much everything else, I don't think you could produce now. But I like She Would Be a Soldier. It's a little bit like it's a little bit on the like Netflix rom-com kind of like don't go into it thinking you're going to get high drama or anything. Um, but so he had this like limited success as an Indian in like a minor role. He wanted to star as an Indian. He became an Indian right at the upswing of the real popularity for these Indian plays. Um, Metamora is not the best play from the 1830s, but it's also not the worst play. Like it's a decently written play. It is a really exciting story. There's battles and there's these, like very admirable, virtuosic kind of monologues because it's Forrest and Forrest wants to do what Forrest does best. And then nobody else ever played for it, Metamora, because Forrest owned the play because of how it worked with the playwriting contest. He never allowed it to be published in his lifetime. So there were like no competing interpretations of Metamora. And he played it for like 30 something years. So it meant generations of theater goers are encountering the Metamora. There's one version. And because he was so popular, because there's all of this response to him, because there's all these attention, there's paintings, there are Currier and Ives and like portraits, there's the sort of merch of Metamora that's possible across the decades that he's playing. It then becomes the most well known, and then it shifts into like the most written about and the easiest to get your hands on from a 21st century perspective. A lot of the other plays, the scripts aren't extant. You don't like you just it's hard to track them down. Metamora's script was actually lost for a very long time, and there were sort of parts of it, and it wasn't completed until like the 1960s when they finally found like missing Act 4 in Britain because he traveled and did some of the performances in England. So like it was inaccessible script for decades and decades, but like loomed large in people's memories, and the way that people like really loved it. There was several biographers of Forrest who talked about its sort of audience reception, and he had catchphrases and that became used in conversations of like daily life. And there were, like one biographer talks about a story of like boys in the street, sort of reenacting parts of Metamora and doing the voice, and because Forrest's voice was very distinctive. And so it became part of kind of pop culture, and in a way that I think also really cemented it as the Indian play. At least looking back, it's the Indian play. And so we've preserved it and we paid attention to it and we've thought about it and we've taken care of it. And spent decades looking for the lost fourth act. And so I think it's a little bit of all of that together. Um, Yeah, I'm thinking of other Indian plays of that time period, and most of them are far more like heavy-handed,
Yeah.
and less well written, basically.
Mhm.
So it is also of the better quality dramatically and
Yep.
writing. So I think that also helps with some staying power. Although there were other super popular play that are happening, that are absolutely not like it at all, like Nick of the Woods.
Mhm.
So
Great. So we have great questions in the Q&A, so I will briefly turn things over to Angela, and then we will start addressing some of those questions.
Okay, thank you. Wow, so many things to think about. And yes, thank you for this amazing conversation. I can't wait for your book to be published. And just as a reminder, everybody, we do have a discount code for the pre-order, and Helen will put that into the chat, and we'll also send it out in the email later. If you have any other questions, please put them in the Q&A section while we're talking. I just want to remind everyone that the Bookworm happens monthly on the third Friday of the month. So next month, you'll also receive an email reminder for that program, and you can choose to watch it live, or you will receive an email with a link to the recording later in that day. We will be hosting Ashish Kapoor Siddiq, who will talk about his book, The Archive of Empire, Knowledge, Conquest, and the Making of the Early Modern British World. So that should be a great conversation as well. And then just as a reminder, our latest exhibit is up, An Ungentle Art, Pat Oliphant and the American Tradition of Political Satire. Famed political cartoonist Pat Oliphant did annual residencies at U of M's Wallace House from 1990 to 2016. While he was there, he sketched. And so this exhibit puts Oliphant's cartoons in conversation with historic examples of political satire from America's past, exploring the role that art plays in a democratic culture. So you can come to the Clements Library to visit this exhibit in person until December 13th from noon to 4, Monday through Friday. And we also have a version of the exhibit online, and that actually has a little bit of additional content as well. So I hope you take a look at it. Thanks again to Jean and Bob Julier for sponsoring today's episode of The Bookworm. We are so grateful for everyone who signs on and participates and asks great questions. And if you are ever interested in sponsoring an episode of The Bookworm, you can always reach out to me and let me know. And we appreciate your commitment to this program, no matter what form it takes. And I think we're ready to get to the questions. So, Paul, do you want me to moderate?
No, I can go through them.
Okay.
So there's a question from Tom about how the historical portrayal of Native Americans as taciturn and silent has come about.
yeah. So what linguistic anthropologist Barbara Meek has talked about Hollywood Indian English is the term that she uses. And she really gets into sort of the syntactical differences and grammatical structures and things like that. So I think that, so I know that begins as early as the 1820s, right? So there's what's called like diction in theory, right? The diction of the Indian is different pretty much from the get-go. Not always in all characters, but it's there, it's present, right? And it starts circulating. So the way that the Indian is going to interact differently with language is a very long, like running kind of thing. The Indian as silent is, in my experience, more connected to a 20th century and then becomes like really visible and not audible in like television and film, right? So that rises, and there could be many practical reasons for that. I'm less familiar with the film. So Liza Black has a recent book about Native American actors in Hollywood. And Michelle Waheja has a book that has been foundation called Reservation Realism. Can't remember the title. Anyway, Michelle Waheja's work has also paid a lot of attention to Native American representation in film. So I would point anybody in that direction to get like a much better like answer than what I'm giving right now. But there's something really interesting about the way that Native Americans have been perceived as broken English, right? This is one thing, but also really good at oration. Right. A lot of 19th century accounts and earlier accounts are of, like the chief stands up and orates, and we have these records of orations, and we have these, like English versions that are attributed to chiefs. So there's both something historically where people assumed that Indians were really good at talking. And then we also have Indians who are like always using broken English, who are sort of bad at English. And then we have like the Indian as silent figure. So I'm actually really intrigued by why is there something about language and communication and sort of limitations and strengths that does seem to follow the Indian into different spaces. I'll stop there because probably everything else is very sort of hypothetical as far as an answer.
Sure. So we have a question about Native American traditional philosophies and perhaps also religion, which are, of course, quite complex and sophisticated. Are they represented as part of Redface?
Rarely. Like I'm thinking of all the plays that I've read. In the like 19th century, my dog is barking. I don't know if you can hear that, and I'm sorry, but it probably means that somebody is looking on our site. That's probably what that means. During like the Indian play, early 19th century, sort of spiritual practices are not it, right? Like that's not what people are paying attention to. Certainly not among sort of Wild West, late 19th century. There's more attention to sort of ceremonial practices as what you like ethnological exhibits. So that's happening in American and sort of Anglophone audiences across North America and Europe, but those tend to be located in things like fairs, sometimes like sideshows, right, that are like museum spaces where people are coming in to specifically perform dances or songs or ceremonies for paying audiences. But in theater proper, sort of commercial theater, it's not something that's engaged with much across the 19th century. And then it becomes a little more across the 20th century, particularly like post 1960s, when there's a real shift, which is sort of like beyond the historical scope of the book. There's actually a really big shift in the representational practices and the kinds of stories and dramaturgy of the Indian and American culture. It becomes a much more what I call like a sympathetic Indian. This is the Indian that cries because of pollution. This is the Indian that sits in like Arthur Coppin's Indians, right? Like that really serves as a way to think through the guilt or the failures of America. And so it becomes a location of sort of wisdom and maybe spiritual strength. That's just not happening across most of the 19th and the early 20th centuries in the same kind of ways. Although the fascination with the spirituality and ceremonial practices is there, it's just kind of in different quarters.
Great. So I'm going to combine a couple questions here. Tim asks if you've examined Sterling Harjo's work and how do you think it has affected the nation's understanding of Indian country? And that connects to a sort of a larger question about how about Native American engagement in their representation in contemporary media.
Yeah, so this is something that's also fun to talk about. There is a much broader there's sort of more broad opportunities now And there is a stronger presence for Indigenous artists in a lot of different artistic mediums. Film and television is the big one that gets paid a lot of attention. Sterling Harjo worked in sketch comedy for years and has come to like much more influence and fame when the genre that he's working in shifts, right? So his television film kind of work is very significant, along with things like Larissa Fasthorse's playwriting, Mary Catherine Nagel's playwriting, Sydney Freeman's directing. Right, like so there's just more Native artists in the genres that are more popular in America right now. This is sort of not a fluke. This is years of investment and expansion. And, like Sundance has had a Native film initiative for years and years, right? So there's really concerted effort. There's like Native film festivals. There's actually a lot of Native film festivals, like more than I knew about. I got connected with a Native film festival in Virginia a couple years ago. So yes, Native artists are more active in creating representations and storytelling than they have previously been. They are certainly getting more attention and more resources to do so, right? So I would say like Native artists have always been active in doing things. It's just whether people noticed it and whether they had time and resources to expand it, right? Right. Again, like, Gwango Mohawk is a Native woman writing a play for herself to perform the starring role in like 1895, 98, something like that, right? So to say like Native artists haven't had any control over their image or their work is just not true. Significantly more control now, yes, but like it's a long history of people to kind of get to this space where there's this explosion, everybody's noticing it. The explosion of Sterling Harjo's work is built on like smoke signals from the 90s and that film that was groundbreaking, right? So it's not, it didn't come out of nowhere, is what I'm saying. But it is really important in ways that, like I teach, perpetual 18 to 22-year-olds. And what they have encountered now is Sterling Harjo's work, right? And I'm having to teach them, just so you know, the reason that Sterling Harjo's work and its like specificity and its attention to like what it means to be like Native in Oklahoma, in like Muskogee, is totally different from what you had before, because like here's what Western movies were like, and here's what Redface was like, and here's what sports mascots were like, and right. And so I'm doing that, like, let me introduce you to like the reason why this is such a big deal, that which is a nice problem to have, that the most popular version or the most accessible versions of Native lives as told on screen and stage are actually by Native people, that's a shift, right? That has not been the case for a long time. And there's a lot of really exciting work happening.
So there's a question in the chat that didn't make it into the Q&A about gender and Redface. So a lot of the images that you showed are of men. Can you talk a bit about how Redface is a gendered phenomenon?
Yeah. I spend most of chapter 2 talking specifically about this topic. Redface is very masculinist. It is a very gendered representational practice. That is not to say that there is not sort of female Redface happening alongside all the way, right? It's just never getting the same kind of attention. So like the second chapter, I talk about Pocahontas plays, about like what does it mean to have a female identified Indian character portrayed over several decades in stories that are very familiar, but also shift a lot in how like they understand. And so the representational practices, I mean, feathers and face paint like are pretty strong for hundreds of years. That kind of doesn't really go away much. So there are some things that stay the same, but for female characters, it can work very differently. So with all of the talk about Metamora and Edwin Forrest, Metamora's wife in that play, Namioki, is actually a really interesting character. Like nobody ever talks about Namioki, right? She serves as this like political emissary between Metamora, like the Wampanoag, and the Narragansett, I think, because like her brother is the Narragansett chief, or like she has this interesting role. She talks to Metamora and is basically like, don't go to war. I don't think it's a good idea. And, like they have an engaged conversation. Like she's an actually interesting character in the show, and is like kind of never talked about. So there are representations of Native women across all of this. They tend to like work a little differently, even though they're still the same sort of racialization ends, some similar techniques. But like women are almost always portrayed as submissive or subservient, as sort of winnable, that Native men are often portrayed as violent or proud, or like in a way that like you have to confront those, but women you don't have to confront in the same way. So there's some really interesting things happening around gender and how these like racialized constructions of Indianness for women and for men are very different, even if they have the goal of racialization and the byproduct of denying Indigenous sovereignty. They're actually working in different ways, and that has really not been paid attention to much.
So we have a question from Susan about the highly scripted nature of theater and how it's different from other forms of representation that involve collaboration of the audience or listener.
So I'm trying to think through like what might those other examples be that she's thinking of. I'm thinking like sports fans at a game, right? Which is, yes, less scripted than a play. And so actually can go in a lot of different directions that plays just can't go, right? There.
I mean, like you talk about it in the book about going to a Wild West village in Illinois, which is maybe kind of another example.
Yes, that is. So I would say like all of those actually have scripts. They're they're what you might call like physical scores, not textual scripts like a theater, right? Like, but if you're a sports fan and you go to the Florida State Seminoles or the Kansas City Chiefs, there is actually a song that you sing, right? And it's actually the same song in all the stadiums, depending, like, so there is actually one song that you sing, and there are choreographed motions for these kind of spaces. And there are chants and there are cheers and there are specific visual markers that would indicate your participation in this particular kind of performance venue. Um, so that's still happening, right? It's actually still scripted in a kind of way, but it's not language script. In the case of like the Wild West town that I went to several years ago, which is no longer open, yeah, it sort of clearly outlived its economic vibrancy when I was there. So it's not really surprising that it's not open for those kind of reasons. But so it was like, in October, come to the Wild West town, bring your kids, and you can exchange beads with an Indian for a pumpkin. And so I took my kids because I had heard that this thing existed and I really wanted to see it, but you have to have a kid to do it. So I was like, I can't just go do it by myself. So I enlisted my children as my research assistants, and they were a little like, "Are you sure you really want us to do this, Mom?" And I said, "No, like you have to." So we go to this Wild West town. It's like a little amusement park for sort of elementary school age kids. They get to pick out the beads. They basically had like Mardi Gras beads hanging because I was wondering like what beads did we change? It was Mardi Gras beads. Because they're easy and they're cheap, right? And you just have a necklace and the kid can wear it and then they don't have to put it in a pocket. And anyway, very practical. We get on the little train and the train takes us out to the edge of the property, where there's some teepees set up and there's a man who says he's a trader, Trader. And And he, tells us that a chief is there and he's like willing to trade all of these pumpkins. So they have rows of pumpkins set out on the ground, for the beads that the children would like. And he teaches the children some sort of plain sign language and then says, here's what's going to happen. And so the kids line up and this man comes out in sort of upscale robe with vague Indian decorations on it and a big headdress and some face paint that's smudged. So he either like rubbed his face at some point in the day earlier, or he didn't use enough setting powder, but and silent, totally silent, right? This is like the taciturn Indian, because as soon as they open their mouth, like, they're not the Indian, because like Indians have to talk a certain way, and right, like that's actually a skill to talk that Hollywood Indian in English, and it requires a particular kind of performance skill and sort of quality of the performer that is not necessarily available to everybody. So this is one of my guesses about Hollywood films of silence, of like, what would it mean to have the sound of an Indian? And that actually takes work. So like, they just don't have to, because they're not that important in the stories. So anyway, so this character comes out and he sits on a hay bale and the kids line up and they hand the beads and, he looks at the beads and then they sign to each other. And then of course he trades all of the beads for the pumpkin. So the kids get to pick a pumpkin. And even that is scripted, right? Like we had a guide who was telling us exactly what would happen, where the children would stand, what their actions, right? It's not audible, it's not textual, but it's still a script, right? And this is what I mean by it's like a physical score of how you do an Indian. And I was having a conversation last year about this, and someone was asking me about sort of the mass-produced technologies that we have, right? Like television and film and print media that, didn't exist in the same kind of ways in the 19th century. And does that make it easier to either perpetuate redface and stereotypes or, like what's happening? And I said, well, these these technologies that allow for like repetitions, yeah, they do that work, but the like technology that's actually the easiest and the lowest cost that replicates is the human body. And we're actually really good at passing on physical scores. And last summer, we were on a family trip to Colorado for a family reunion, and we stopped because I'm fascinated by all things Indians at this place in Nebraska that was like tourist trap, super kitschy, like trading post fort themed with a bunch of Indian stuff everywhere. And in the back, they had a area that kids could run around is basically what it was. So like I took my youngest and let her run around and there was like a jail cell. But then there was one of those old like fiberglass, those muffler man, you know what I'm talking about? Like mid-century. It had been repainted as an Indian. It was amazing. It was like a muffler man in redface. And so I'm letting, my youngest run around, get some energy out before we have to get back in the car. And there's another family with two younger kids, maybe 3 and 5. And I hear the little boy say, "There's an Indian." And I was like, oh, now I want to know what the next thing is. So I'm standing really still. And then he says, "Let's fight him." And then I hear, "Oh." And I was like, how do you know that? That like physical script, that interpretive knowledge of like threat, violence, fight, audible sound, what my body is supposed to be doing when you're 5 in 2023. Like that's what I mean by like the technology of the body is the thing that we keep going. And that's exactly when like the Kansas City Chiefs banned headdresses in the stadium. They didn't ban the tomahawk chop. They didn't ban the chant, right? So like the embodied part of it, the linguistic and the visual markers start leaving, but the things we do with our body stays the same. I find that really fascinating. Sorry, I've gotten like way off track because I think it's so weird and disturbing and also amazing about like what is the persistence of things that we know with our bodies and how careful do we need to be about what we do with our bodies?
Well, and when our bodies are put into those situations, we know what we're supposed to do because of the history that you lay out in the book. So we have more questions than we have time to answer. So I just want to pose one last question. Suzanne asks if you could talk about the iconography of the cover and how it relates to the theme of your book.
Yes, thank you. I love this. I'm so excited about the cover. So I wanted something of the cover. I'm looking at the clock because I know I have really long answers.
So I specifically asked the artist, there's like 20 or 30 of these images in this cultural appropriation work that he did. I specifically asked him for something that was ho-chunk, one of these patterns as ho-chunk, because he said, I asked for, I'm sorry, dog again. One that's Anishinaabe, because I wrote the book in Michigan on Anishinaabe lands. The one that has the diamond, the blue diamond shape thing, that's actually not Choctaw pattern, but diamond shaped is Choctaw, is my nation's like one of our like iconographic kind of images, like diamond shape is a Choctaw thing. And then I asked him for one that was as close to Lenape as possible because the press is NYU Press. And so that's like Lenape land. So that's why these actual 4 among all of the options exist. And so he selected the ones that were, you know, like closest to what I was asking for. But I wanted people to think about what do they think Redface is? Most people think Redface is white people dressing up like Indians. And these are images of sort of, you know, legibly white figures in, you know, what we consider modern wear for the time period, you know, this image was created originally, but then laying over on top of that, like what is being laid over on top of a white representation? And what does the specificity of these textiles and patterns give us about like what is native, what is Indian, what is representing, what is representative? And so I wanted it to evoke those ideas of like dressing up and playing Indian, but in a way that was unrecognizable as playing Indian, right? I actually really didn't want a feathered headdress on the cover at all. And so what would people sort of understand, but then not quite know why it was working the way that it was? And because that's what I wanted to sort of unsettle expectations around Redface, while still really thinking about what does it mean to appropriate? What does it mean to dress up? What does it mean to be a non-native person portraying a native person? And I just thought this collection of Tom Jones was really interesting. And yeah, that's why I put the website. Go look at it. Really pretty.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Bethany. This has been great. Everybody order the book. It's really, really wonderful. And I will turn things back over to Angela.
Well, thank you so much. This has been amazing. And thank you to our audience members for all of their good questions as well. And Bethany, I'll send you the full file of questions so you can think about those a little bit more. All righty. Thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.